Everything you think you know about Ludwig van Beethoven may rest on a portrait that does not tell the full story. Not the music stands. But the man behind the music, the person whose genome researchers have now recovered from strands of his own preserved hair, looks less like the powdered wig portrait hanging in every music appreciation class, and more like a question the history books never bothered to ask. A recent round of genomic analysis, building on the landmark 2023 Cell Journal study of authenticated Beethoven hair samples, has pushed further than the original paper dared. The original study, led by a team of geneticists from Cambridge, the Max Planck Institute, and Kew Leuven, confirmed the composer's Y chromosome did not match his acknowledged paternal line. It also flagged genetic predispositions to liver disease and confirmed hepatitis B infection in the months before his death. Those findings were already a significant rewriting of Beethoven's biography. But they were not the headline that has emerged from the follow-up work. The newer analyses, reported by several independent labs attempting to replicate and extend the 2023 results, are suggesting something that the original team handled with extreme caution. Beethoven's ancestral composition, according to these more recent admixture models, does not cleanly fit the profile of a Central European man born in Bonn in 1770. There are components in his autosomal DNA that, depending on the reference panel used, pull the signal toward the southern Mediterranean, parts of the Near East, and in at least one model, toward populations of North African origin? Before anyone rushes to rewrite the Wikipedia page, let us slow down. This is exactly the kind of finding that requires careful handling, because the history of genetics is littered with headlines that outran their evidence. What we are going to walk through in the next 20 minutes is not a tabloid reveal. It is a careful look at what the data actually shows, what it probably means, what it almost certainly does not mean, and why the answer to a question as simple as, quote, "Where did Beethoven's family really come from?" end quote, turns out to be anything but simple. Start with the hair. 8 authenticated locks of Beethoven's hair have been preserved in various collections since shortly after his death in March of 1827. The 2023 Cell study sequenced 5 of them. 3 were confirmed through cross-referencing shared genetic markers as coming from the same individual. 2 were excluded. The 3 confirmed samples form the foundation of the Beethoven genome that researchers have been analyzing ever since. One lock, known as the Stumpf lock, has been the most extensively studied. It was taken from the composer's head the day after he died by his friend Anton Halm, and eventually passed to the English pianist Johann Andreas Stumpf. Its chain of custody is remarkably well documented. The DNA recovered from it is degraded, as all historical DNA is, but the quality is high enough to reconstruct roughly 96% of the autosomal genome, and to sequence the mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages in full. The Y chromosome was the first surprise. Beethoven's Y chromosome haplogroup is IZ139, a subclade common in parts of Europe, but crucially, it did not match the Y chromosome of any of the 5 living male descendants of the Van Beethoven paternal line who volunteered samples for the study. That is a polite way of saying that somewhere in the composer's direct male ancestry, a child was fathered by someone who was not the acknowledged father. Geneticists call this a non-paternity event. Historians with more flair call it a family secret. It could have happened in Beethoven's own generation, or 2 generations back, or 5. The data cannot tell us when. Only that it happened. That alone rewrote part of the composer's family tree. But the autosomal analysis, which looks at contributions from all ancestors, not just the direct male line, is where things became genuinely interesting. The 2023 team ran Beethoven's autosomal DNA against a reference panel of modern European populations. The best fit broadly was Flemish and Rhineland German, which is consistent with his known Bonn upbringing and his family's Flemish origins. But several follow-up analyses, including one posted as a preprint from a team working out of Leipzig, noted that Beethoven's genome contained small, but statistically significant signals that did not fit cleanly into any single modern European population. This is where the story gets nuanced. Those signals can be interpreted in at least 3 different ways, and honest scientists will admit that the current data cannot definitively choose between them. The first interpretation is the most mundane. European populations have always been genetically mixed. There's no such thing as a pure European bloodline, and the idea that there ever was one is itself a historical fiction. The Romans brought soldiers and administrators from across the Mediterranean into what is now Germany and the Low Countries for centuries. Moorish-influenced trade routes carried people and their genetic contributions up through Iberia and into northern Europe across the medieval period. Ottoman expansion pushed population movements across the Balkans. By 1770, any given person born in Bonn could, and statistically often did, carry fractional ancestry from regions well beyond the immediate neighborhood. Beethoven's slightly unusual signal might simply reflect the normal mesances of European genetics. The second interpretation is more specific. Some of the North African and Near Eastern signals in Beethoven's genome, according to the Leipzig preprint, cluster in patterns that are consistent with ancestry entering his family tree within the last 300 to 500 years, rather than thousands of years ago. That would place the entry point somewhere in the late medieval or early modern period. If accurate, this would suggest at least one specific ancestor, probably an unrecorded marriage, bringing a distinct genetic contribution into what became the Van Beethoven family line. This is the interpretation that has generated the more provocative headlines. It is plausible. It is not, however, conclusive. The third interpretation is methodological. Admixture analysis is notoriously sensitive to the reference panel used. If you compare an individual's DNA to a panel that does not adequately represent all historical European populations, the algorithm can assign apparent non-European ancestry to segments that are actually just underrepresented European variation. A team at the University of Copenhagen has argued, in direct response to the Leipzig work, that some of the exotic-looking signals in Beethoven's genome disappear when the reference panel is expanded to include more samples from ancient Roman, Byzantine, and early medieval populations of southern and eastern Europe. Their conclusion, phrased carefully, is that Beethoven's genome is unusual for its time only if we assume Europeans of his era were genetically homogeneous, which they were not. So we have 3 honest readings, and the truth almost certainly lies somewhere in the intersection. What is becoming clear, however, is that the simple story, the one in which Ludwig van Beethoven is a straightforward product of unmixed Flemish-German ancestry, does not fully hold up. The genome is more interesting than that. The family tree, as genomes so often reveal, has branches that nobody wrote down. It is also worth pausing on the sheer difficulty of the science itself, because most people do not realize just how hard it is to extract useful DNA from a 200-year-old lock of hair. Hair shafts, unlike bone or teeth, contain very little intact DNA. Most of what can be recovered comes from the follicular end, if any root tissue survived at the time of cutting. The DNA that does survive is fragmented into short sequences, often only a few dozen base pairs long. To reconstruct a full genome, researchers have to align millions of these fragments against modern reference sequences, fill in probabilistic gaps, and carefully screen for contamination from every researcher who has ever handled the sample. The fact that a usable Beethoven genome exists at all is a significant scientific achievement, and the fact that multiple labs have been able to reproduce the core findings adds confidence to the overall picture. But the same technical difficulty that makes the reconstruction possible also makes the edge cases, the small signals, the fractional ancestry components, particularly tricky to interpret. Which brings us to the question that has been quietly lurking in Beethoven's studies for generations. Were there contemporaries who suspected? There is a strange historical footnote worth mentioning. During Beethoven's lifetime, various acquaintances made comments about his physical appearance that, read today, feel uncomfortable to quote directly. His complexion was described repeatedly as darker than was typical for the region. His features were called, in the language of the period, unusual. A caricaturist in Vienna once depicted him with exaggerated features that some modern scholars have argued reflected period biases about perceived ancestry. Beethoven himself, at various points, was subject to rumors that his actual biological father was not the man who raised him, and even that his family's origins were not what the official record suggested. None of these contemporary observations prove anything on their own. 19th-century European commentary about appearance is a minefield of projection and prejudice, and reading modern genetic categories back into it is a kind of historical malpractice. But taken together with the genomic signals now emerging, they start to form a pattern. The pattern is not that Beethoven was secretly from somewhere else. The pattern is that Europe and European genealogies have always been more entangled, with the rest of the world than the 19th century's tidy national narratives like to admit. Dr. Tristan Baig, a population geneticist at the University of Bordeaux who was not involved in the original study, put it this way in a recent interview. Quote, "The real finding is not that Beethoven was secretly this or secretly that. The real finding is that the concept of a secretly this, or secretly that depends on assumptions about purity that the data has never supported." End quote. The question is less about Beethoven's personal ancestry, and more about what we have been projecting onto European history all along. There is another dimension to this story that rarely surfaces in the headlines, and it is worth naming directly. For generations, classical music scholarship has been shaped by assumptions about who belongs in its central canon and who stands at its edges. The notion of Beethoven as a quintessentially European figure was not just a biographical detail. It was a structural load-bearing piece in a larger cultural architecture, one that sorted composers into hierarchies partly on the basis of perceived lineage. If the genomic record is now quietly saying that the figure at the very top of that hierarchy carried a more tangled ancestry, then anyone had assumed the implications stretch well beyond Beethoven himself. They ask us to reconsider, gently but firmly, how much of what we call European genius was ever really as culturally self-contained as the mythology insisted. This is not an indictment of anyone in particular. Musicologists, biographers, and historians worked with the records they had. Nobody is being accused of falsification. It is simply that when the records are the letters, diaries, portraits, and family trees that people chose to preserve, what you end up with is the story that was convenient to tell. DNA, by contrast, tells the story that actually happened, whether anyone wanted it told or not. The gap between those two stories in Beethoven's case appears to be small but real, and the small real gap is exactly the kind of thing science is designed to surface. Still, the skeptical view deserves serious space here because this story is easy to sensationalize. Dr. Katarina Volkov, a bioarchaeologist at the University of Vienna, has publicly cautioned against the more dramatic readings of the data. Her argument is straightforward. The authenticated Beethoven samples are limited. Hair DNA degrades unevenly. The autosomal reconstructions rely on statistical inference, and small shifts in the reference panel can produce large shifts in the apparent ancestry composition. Her view is that the confirmed findings, the Y chromosome mismatch and the hepatitis infection, are solid. The broader ancestry claims are, in her words, interesting leads, not settled conclusions. She is not wrong to urge caution. The peer-reviewed record on this is still actively developing. New analyses are being submitted. Some will hold up. Others will not. The story we are telling tonight is a snapshot of an ongoing investigation, not a final verdict. There is also a historical angle here that has been underexplored. The Van Beethoven family, before arriving in Bonn, had deep roots in the Flemish region of what is now Belgium. Flanders in the 16th and 17th centuries was a crossroads of enormous complexity. Spanish rule over the Low Countries brought Iberian families, administrators, and soldiers northward, many of whom stayed and intermarried. Iberia itself, in that period, carried the genetic legacy of 8 centuries of Moorish presence, including populations of North African and Near Eastern descent whose DNA had already become widely integrated into the local population. Any Flemish family whose tree extends back far enough will contain traces of that broader Mediterranean tapestry, whether the family itself remembers the specific connections or not. Beethoven's great-grandfather, Michael van Beethoven, was born in Mechelen in the early 1680s, in exactly the sort of community where such mixed heritage was genetically possible and historically plausible. None of this is conspiratorial. It is just the ordinary motion of people across borders, carried forward in the DNA of their descendants. What makes this whole line of research genuinely significant, regardless of how the ancestry question ultimately resolves, is what it reveals about the gap between our cultural mythology and our biological reality. Beethoven, for 2 centuries, has been held up as a kind of archetype of European genius. His music has been used, weaponized even, in arguments about cultural purity and national identity. If the genome of one of the most celebrated figures in that mythology turns out to include strands of ancestry that complicate the neat picture, it does not diminish the music, it does the opposite. It reminds us that human beings have always been the product of movement, encounter, and connection. The idea of an isolated, unmixed genius tradition is itself the fiction. There is something poetic about the fact that Beethoven, who spent his life composing music that seemed to burst beyond the conventions of his time, is now quietly revealing a biography that does the same. The man who ended the Ninth Symphony with a chorus about universal brotherhood may, quite literally, have had universal brotherhood written into his own DNA in ways he never knew. We still do not know, with certainty, where the unexpected signals in his genome originated. We may never know. The specific ancestors who contributed to those segments of DNA lived and died before genealogical records could track them. They left no portraits, no letters, no music of their own that we know of. But their genetic material traveled, generation after generation, until it arrived in the body of a man in Bonn who would go on to change the sound of the world. That is a strange kind of immortality. Quiet ancestors untraceable now, whose contribution to history is preserved not in documents but in the double helix of their famous descendant. Every time someone sits down to play the late quartets, some echo of those forgotten lives is, in a biological sense, still present in the room. The research will continue. More labs are taking up the work. Over the next few years, expect to see refined analyses, new reference panels, and possibly ancient DNA from European burial sites that will let us place Beethoven's unusual signals in much sharper context. The picture will sharpen, or it will shift again. That is how science tends to go. Whatever the final answer looks like, one thing is already clear. The Beethoven of the textbooks, that tidy Central European composer of tidy Central European heritage, was always a simplification. The real man, as his own genome is now whispering, was something more complicated, more interesting, more human. And if a single genome from a single composer can overturn that much of our settled narrative, it is worth asking what other assumptions we have been holding about the past, waiting only for the right lock of hair, the right preserved tooth, the right sequence sample to quietly come undone. What part of this most surprises you? The mismatched Y chromosome? The scattered ancestral signals? Or the simple fact that nobody, for 200 years, thought to ask the question? There is one more thought worth lingering on as the research continues. The hair samples used in these studies were preserved, in most cases, because people who knew and loved Beethoven wanted a piece of him to keep after he was gone. An English pianist. A friend at his deathbed, mourners at his funeral. They clipped those locks as keepsakes, as memorials, as tokens of a connection they did not want to lose. They had no way of knowing that 2 centuries later, the strands they tucked into envelopes and glass lockets would be carefully unwound by scientists with instruments those 19th century admirers could never have imagined. They simply wanted to hold on to something of him. And in doing so, without meaning to, they preserved the biological record that would eventually let us ask questions about his life that his own generation never could have answered. That is, in its own quiet way, a kind of accidental time capsule. A small act of grief in 1827 producing a scientific resource in 2026. People who saved those hairs did not see themselves as contributors to genomics research. They were just saying goodbye. And somehow, through the strange arithmetic of history, their tenderness became the seed of a revelation. Whatever the final picture of Beethoven's ancestry looks like, it will be built from evidence gathered in exactly that spirit. Not conspiracy, not concealment. Just ordinary human attachment, ordinary sample preservation, and the slow, patient work of scientists, trying to understand a man whose music has outlived his century and whose genome, it now turns out, may tell a story wider and stranger than any biography has yet imagined.